That's a lovely introduction, and I appreciate it very much. And thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to come and talk to you all. And I'd like to say hello to my Pathways Fellows who are at Cumberland Lodge, and thank our wonderful director, Ingrid Schoon, who has been our shining light through this whole wonderful postdoctoral program that we have. It's an international postdoctoral program. So hi, Pathways Fellow, hello, Ingrid, and all the rest of you who are out there in webinar land. As we have all become virtual, we really understand what this is all about. So today I'm going to talk to you about the first education-funded study at the National Science Foundation in their what's called higher directorate. This isn't the first education study that NSF has funded, but it's the first that it is funded in education in a series of grants that are typically given to agriculture, physics, scientific places. And it's done because these are collaborative studies with places like China, Africa, and our partner, I am thrilled to say, is Finland. And one of your organizers here, Katarina Salmonella-Arno, who is my co-principal investigator and who is leading the initiative in Finland, has been working on this work. So please do not look at this work as my own, but this is work that we are doing in a very, very big team with a lot of postdoctoral students, graduate students, and 4 PIs, including myself, as I've been introduced. But Katarina and Jari Lavalon from Finland, and my co-principal investigator in the US, Joseph Krajcek. And then, of course, is our very large team. But I allowed my graduate student, Chris Klager, to be put here because he has done and stayed up some very late nights, being able to give you some very first-hand new data. And I always think that if a graduate student goes that extra 10 miles, that the least they can do is see their name on what it is that you're about to do. So thank you, Chris, because I think that this really could not be possible without you. So let me first say to you what I think, if you could just give me a sec. So the question that our work is about is how can physics, and you could say that, how can secondary school science instruction be more engaging and purposeful? And to be able to do that, how are we going about doing that? So what I'm going to do, this is sort of the outline of my talk, and I'm going to explain to you how we go about answering this question. So that's our approach, our design, and our results. I'm going to talk a little bit about the mismatch of physics instruction with future scientific literacy needs, a possible solution, which is project-based learning, how we are measuring the effects of project-based learning, what intrapersonal data are telling us about challenge, creativity, perseverance, and problem solving, and then finally, our plans for subsequent work and some policy and practical recommendations. So let's begin by the mismatch. So what is the mismatch? Well, the mismatch is, at least in the United States, science, particularly at the secondary level, is taught pretty much by learning facts and rote memorization. These are not terribly driven, inquiry-based places. Well, the difficulty with that, as OECD has published, as the United States and Finland both have had commissions on saying, this is not how we want the future to be. It's inconsistent with the 21st century scientific learning skills that we have to develop among young people. And if we look at Silicon Valley, we look at entrepreneurial work that's going on throughout the globe, it's very clear that what we have to develop in our students, which fits very well with the seminar of today, are things like imagination, problem solving, persistence, collaboration. These are the kinds of interpersonal skills that operate with others in a social context that become paramount if we're going to try and engage young people in science so that they develop the scientific literacy skills that they need for the next century. Not for the next century, but just tomorrow. And we're really having a problem with even tomorrow because so many young people don't have these opportunities. So given this kind of situation that we're in right now, how are we going about solving the problem? So what we've done is we've looked at the next generation of science standards that have been developed in the U.S. and are now being adopted singularly by states. In the U.S., education is the kind of the authority of our states, and the federal government doesn't really have that authority structure. In addition to that, our partners in Finland have also developed standards. So both countries have standards, and what are some of the things that kind of classify this behavior as different? Well, first of all, in the NGSS standards, the first thing is the importance of disciplinary core ideas. So in other words, that science, of course, has to have some core content knowledge that's critical. And when we involve students, they have to be involved in scientific practices, not things that are rote memorization, but really learning how you make claims, how you develop evidence, that this is something that has to be a process by which young people are involved. And it has to be cross-cutting. So if you're going to study physics or you're going to be in chemistry, you also need math, you also need reading. These are not things that just can be in one area, but they involve multiple literacies across the spectrum of what we teach in secondary school. So one of the things instructionally that has been proposed for developing and being more matched with these three-dimensional learning ideas is project-based learning. So what we are trying to do is test project-based learning in high school classrooms to see if we implement project-based learning, will the intrapersonal skills of the students be enhanced. So the idea is we're putting in place a treatment. Our treatment is project-based learning, and our outcomes are how young people change their orientation to science. This is a very unusual type of program because it's done being driven by a change in how we're conceiving of science. We're taking a very specific kind of instructional practice and we're evaluating it, but we're evaluating it not in the traditional way, which would be strictly to look at grades and content knowledge, which we are doing that as well, but also to look at what's happening within the individual as they, in fact, engage in these new kinds of practices. So let me just give you a little bit about what project-based learning is for those of you who are not familiar with it. Some people often think about it as inquiry science. It's not quite the same. So one of the things that's different about project-based learning is that it begins with a driving question. that means that that driving question has to be threaded throughout the experience, and it has to be purposeful. It has to resonate with the student about, why am I doing this? The why I'm doing this is really critical. And then there have to be learning goals. And the learning goals have to be articulated. Then there has to be, of course, participation in scientific practices, collaborative activities. It has to be scaffolded with technology, because we can't teach science, of course, today without that. And there has to be the creation of a tangible product, an artifact, something by which we can develop formative assessments instead of the typical kind of summative assessments that we usually do. So this is our treatment. Remember, our treatment. Okay, so how do we implement project-based learning? So how do we implement our treatment, and how do we measure the fidelity of that implementation? First of all, we have to have experts that teach it. That's why Joe Krychek, Yari Lavalone, Deborah Peak-Brown, and Kali and Finland have all been employed to be part of developing the content of this. And then we have to find teachers that are willing to change their practice. And that's not always, as we know, so easy to do. And the process itself has to be collaborative. It has to allow the teachers agency and ownership over their own lessons. We can't hand them a manual and say, do it. We know that that doesn't work. And there has to be time for design, revision, and evaluation. The lessons have to be designed collaboratively, and they have to involve activities that require figuring things out, explaining phenomenon, making claims, not doing science the way we have typically done it. So, like every other major empirical study that we do, we have to have some assumptions. So what would we expect to happen if we're testing this instructional technique? What do we think we might see as different? Well, for the students, we would hope that they would be more engaged, that they would use their imagination. We'd see problem-solving behavior. They'd collaborate with others. They'd persist in explaining phenomenon, and they would create artifacts. But it's not just the students we're looking at. We're also concerned about the teachers. So what is it about the teachers? Because in intrapersonal, when we're looking at that as a key understanding, we don't act independently. We always are acting in a context. And that context means if you're going to study intrapersonal skills, you sure better understand with whom you're doing those things. Or otherwise it has no meaning. Because you don't become happy by sitting alone in the room. These are the kinds of things that require us to look at dyads, to look at context, to look at peer groups. So what do we expect of the teachers? Well, we're hoping that they can perfect the design of driving questions that fit these ideas of three-dimensional learning, that they will engage in formative assessment, not just the summative assessment of giving the quizzes and tests, and they will provide, most importantly, opportunities for students to solve problems. So, now the more difficult part. How are we testing PBL? Well, first of all, we are in what we call a 3-year design phase. And we're currently in year 2 of that design phase. So when I talked about finding teachers willing to participate, this is a purposive design at this time. It will not be in year 4. We will be scaling, and we will be scaling to other states. What we're trying to do right now in both Finland and the US is to perfect our instrumentation, our measurements, our manuals, what we're doing, all of that, to be able to move it out to many more teachers, many more schools. So how do we do that? Well, even in this preliminary stage, we're using what's called the single case design, which I'm going to show you. In the single case design, basically your pretest is what you do in terms of business as usual, and then what happens to you and your class when you're in a PBL experience. We use the experience sampling method with smartphone technology. We use the same smartphone technology in Finland as we use in the United States. We also are doing video coding and interviews with students and teachers. Now let me go to the ESM just for a minute, because I feel that that's really kind of what is critical in the context of this particular experience. We're using software that's by a colleague of mine at Google. His name is Robert Evans. I gave a talk one time and I said, is anybody a design person? And Bob said, I am. In fact, I've got your instrument on your phone right now. If you want, you will be able to go to what's called PACO. If you put and type in PACO, it is a free software program that any of you can use and sign up for an experiment. This is really a unique opportunity for everybody in the world. Right now they have over 600 of these going on all over. So let me switch back and give you the big picture, which is the single case design and how we're doing this. So this year we're teaching a single lesson in the fall and then 2 lessons in the spring. And essentially what happens, I don't have a pointer, but if you look at baseline is normal instruction. So we go in with the ESM and we measure how the kids and the teachers are feeling when they're doing their ordinary science work. Then we come back and we do how they are feeling during the project-based learning experience. And then we measure that afterward. But because of it being a single case design, you have to do that twice. So essentially what we're doing is we're doing A1, B1, and then we're looking at B2 and A2, because we have to be able to have post signals. And the post signals give us an opportunity to be able to look at what happened first. So this is the kind of treatment effect. For those of you that understand RCTs, this is essentially what we're measuring the mean differences. Like, are these differences in challenge and all these other experiences that people have, are they different from the A period to the B period? And that's essentially what we're measuring. Now, let's talk a little bit about the experience sampling method, because this is what it looks like on the phone. Now, I've been working with ESM. I worked with Mahalia Csikszentmihalyi in the 90s. We have books and papers about how we've used the ESM. At that time, we used it with watches. This is a much better opportunity. It's much faster, and you get the data right away, and I'll explain to you how quickly you get it in a minute. But the other thing that we've learned, which I don't know how many people in this room are going to be happy with this, we have found that if you use a 5, a 7, or a 9 Likert scale, it isn't going to make too much of a difference. You're just as better off using a 4-point scale by which the kids can go through it quickly enough. We're going to have less burden, less missing data, and the results are as reliable. So it's not the question that you lose so much of our precision by moving to a 5, a 7, or a 9, which was very much during the early 90s, a major discussion among so many people that use psychological measurement, and we can't find much of a difference. Moreover, we can't find much of a difference when we use these as opposed to larger scale studies that are just surveying one time only, and that we find this to be just fine for the purposes that we're doing. So the first thing that we ask that's very important is, these are the kinds of questions where, and I'm going to take you through them. But this is the key question that we're interested in turning out about the treatment itself. So were you being asked questions? Were you defining problems? Were you developing models? So all of these are on the phones. So if you look at this shows you what comes up on the phone for the student to answer. It takes about 1.5 minutes to answer this. So what were you learning about science when signaled? So there's 3 major dimensions here. Who were you with? That we have to have that. We have to have that participatory part of who you're with. And then, were you doing that activity because you wanted to, had to, or nothing else to do? There's your volition item. And that's very key to what we want to look at. And then what were you doing? Was it more like schoolwork, more like play, both, or neither? This is an idea that Csikszentmihalyi and I have had. Jen Schmidt has written one paper on this, and this is an area that we really hope that we can develop more. It has to do with the fact of people that are looking at an activity as both pleasurable and like work, that these are probably going to be the kinds of experiences that are going to be the most satisfying to the self. So these are some areas that we, of course, would like to pursue more in the future. So how did you feel? Now we're getting into the interpersonal, how you felt. Were you interested in what you were doing? Did you feel skill? Did you feel challenge? Interest, skill, challenge. Those are our 3 key dimensions in measuring engagement. Interest, skill, challenge. It relates somewhat to the concept of flow that Csikszentmihalyi used, whereby you're so engaged in an activity that you feel as if time has flown by. Here what we're looking at is we're looking at above your averages in interest, skill, and challenge to measure how engaged you were in a particular activity. Then the question is, did you feel like giving up? This is Angela Duckworth's persistence idea. The beauty of this is in Finland, not in the US, but in Finland, which I've come to learn and understand, is the concept of sisu, which is really not grit. It is a very important thing to understand that grit and sisu are not really the same. Why? Because sisu is a national identity. It has to do with what makes you a Finn. It's a very unusual kind of a concept. When in the United States we have individualization. So different countries have different kinds of motives and ways by which people identify what makes you a particular citizen of a particular place. And why and how is this such a key concept? When you look at the history of Finland and you understand kind of its issues and its independence, and you understand how they lost over 1 million people in terms of starvation and exiting in a very small country of 6 million, you start to get a very different understanding about why grit and why situ could never be grit. It isn't just the persistence, it's who you are as a person in a country, your own national identity. So, also, how well were you concentrating? What were you doing? Were you in control of what you were doing? And were you succeeding? Then, how did you feel about this? Was it important to you? This is a key question for us. This is the purposefulness idea. How important was it to your relational plans? Were you living up to the expectations of others? Were you so absorbed in that activity that time flew by? So we're going to try and get a direct measure of flow. How determined were you to accomplish this task? Again, we didn't want, because Angela was very strict about not making sure that we put in her grit scale, because she felt it didn't work with the ESM. So therefore, we've been working, and we think that this question of determinism may be something that might help us really understand the persistence value. And then we started to build in, using the OECD measures as well, these ideas that we think are the entrepreneurial kinds of things and ways of process that we believe should be an outcome of engagement. I use my imagination. I solve problems with more than one solution. I explore different points of view. And I can make connections with other school subjects. If you recall these three-dimensional learning pieces that I talked about in the beginning. And then, of course, the typical ones: did you feel happy, excited, anxious, competitive, lonely, stressed, self-confidence, etc. We think that, and we have a very strong conceptual model that's been published in the Journal of Science I'm teaching about engagement and what other kinds of intrapersonal feelings you're going to have if you're highly engaged. If you're highly engaged, we think that there are going to be these positive feelings that are going to happen to you. And there will be you will have low detractors, like feeling bored or being confused. And then we think you're going to need a little bit of anxiety, which we call accelerants. We think that the accelerants are really important, but they have to kind of give you a, just that little boost, not a whole lot of it. So, what have we found? Well, this is one of those things that I said to Chris, I really want to be able to give something. When I talk, I don't like to give the same talk. I have this problem about that. So here I wanted to share with you something brand new. So what we found, because we were so interested in this concept of anxiety and how much of that accelerant you need, and we are not exactly clear about challenge and how challenge works intrapersonally, we looked at what were the highest correlates of challenge in the baseline. This is before we started doing the project-based learning. And what we found is we saw anxiety, we saw confusion, we saw giving up, and we saw stress. So these were some of the kinds of emotions that the kids told us they had in science during a typical science lesson. Now, when we gave the PBL experience to the kids, and now we're talking now like, it's over 300 students overall, 8,000 beeps overall. So these are big numbers. I mean, these are, when I tell you things are significant, we're really looking at huge numbers. So when we went during the PBL experience, isn't this interesting how these different kinds of things start to happen? Considering different points of view, using your imagination, importance to future, importance to self, making connections. Remember, these are all those things that were asked. They get asked, each student roughly has about as many as 20 beeps, so we have huge cell sizes. I didn't go into a lot of the statistical part of this, which I can do if you ever want. We can send out more information about this. But essentially, we have lots of beeps, lots of kids, so we have very nice cell sizes by which we're able to look at these things and be able to understand their significance. So when we look at the US, what we see is these are the ones that I still cannot believe, because in a single case method, we've got use your imagination, be able to have different points of view, and they're highly significant for this kind of work, which to us, and if you look at the standard errors, it's not like we have huge standard errors, they're small, so it's not like we have a huge amount of variance associated around the, and we're very excited about these findings. These have to do with creativity. Now, the importance to future, the effect size is very strong. This kind of figuring things out with a positive outlook, and the driving questions are important elements of the PBL.
We think that this issue of importance to your future and importance to yourself are key to enhancing engagement in science classes. We also think, by the way, that they're it's not just science, that this is what learning is really about. We really have to refocus our efforts on trying to understand that kids will not pay attention when it's not about something that they understand that's relevant to their lives. Not only to their lives at that time and to themselves, but their lives in the future as well. What's the problems? Well, clearly, you know, we have a purposeful sample. It's not one that is going to be generalizable yet, but hopefully one day soon. We don't know if these effects, which I just showed you, are sustaining. Are they going to keep on? What about, are the kids going to, revert back? Are the teachers going to continue to use driving questions? And also, we're thinking that as our teachers become more proficient at being able to do this work, is it going to happen that we're going to see less of an effect? So as I said, what are we doing? We're increasing our student sample. We are verifying our results with video. We're spending a lot of time right now developing coding manuals that fit the ESM so we can triangulate all of our work. We're refining our units so our professional development activities are better, and we're incorporating new measures of engagement like facial recognition. And we're using some of the work that Sam DeMello at Notre Dame, this is very cutting edge work developed out of Berkeley that he's been redoing. We're going to do both facial recognition and voice recognition to be able also to verify these issues of anxiety and stress, etc. So what does this all mean? So what's the takeaway? Is there a takeaway here? And I told Lars, absolutely I can do a takeaway. What's the first thing I can do as a takeaway? Well, I can tell you that project-based learning is working. I have, if you don't know what it is and people aren't using it in these colleges and schools of education across the globe, they ought to be, because it really works. And when you go into the classrooms and you look at the video and you see how kids are interfacing around project-based learning, it's like one of those aha moments. I don't know how many of you ever used something called SRA, which was scientific research, and you used to have a little sheet of paper, and if you did a certain thing and then you got moved to another color, there are certain kinds of instructional techniques that do better than others, and this is one. The most important thing for me in terms of interpersonal relationships, which I would like to underscore not once, twice, but 3 times, emotions vary throughout the day. You are not a happy person all day long. And if we don't stop doing these single measures on surveys to try and determine happiness, we're just missing the bone entirely. Because what we've seen with engagement, you can be engaged at a certain time, but then not be engaged in another time. And if we want to be able to enhance engagement, we have to find the propitious moments at which we see that. We cannot look at these things and not understand that they are situationally motivated. They happen in context. They do not happen because you're sitting at your desk writing something. It has to be important to you. The writing assignment has to be something that's valued. It has to be something that has some interpersonal way of intersecting with your context in some way. And I think that our biggest task right now is to find and create environments that motivate engagement and positive feelings of self and others. That's what we have to do, because we all know there are these problems in schools. We all are very much aware that we're not getting maximum achievement out of young people. So how can we do that? How can we form more adaptive kinds of strategies that are going to be positive for young people? And finally, that the kinds of things that we do, and I'm talking about we being the collective, all of us in this room, in terms of interpersonal measures, they can be extraordinarily, you can instrument them, meaning that we can find ways to instrument them, and they can be very predictive when they're appropriately measured and captured, not just at the student level, but understanding that at the class and instructional level as well. I am very happy to have had this opportunity to talk to you, and I'd be thrilled to take questions. Thank you.
Let's take some questions for Barbara. Reinhard, go.
So that really is a fascinating project. Thank you so much for this overview. I would have one comment and one question. I mean, this AB design, in this case, I wonder to what extent the baseline really constitutes a baseline. I mean, traditional instruction is a treatment as well, right? So it's about treatment A and treatment B. Now, what would happen if it would be treatment at B, I mean, PBL all the time over? Then, I mean, PBL would become kind of a baseline, right? It would no longer be U, it would no longer be an alternative. And so from that perspective, I mean, maybe it would be worthwhile to complementing this design in upcoming studies with the traditional between design to get a more complete picture. And my question would be, I mean, you looked into, you talked about engagement-related outcomes, affective outcomes. Did you look into cognitive outcomes as well? I mean, that's the other critical question that, I mean, you're likely to be asked, right?
Yeah, so answers to both. The first is we're very clear, that's exactly what's going to happen, is that the teachers are going to become very proficient at PBL. In our scale-up design, we'll do a very classic randomized control trial, where we'll have schools that will be matched by propensity matchingness or other kinds of ways by which they'll look very similar to the schools. We'll teach the teachers PBL, and then we will be measuring teachers that do PBL as opposed with teachers that do traditional work. We're only using this AB design for our preliminary work.
Okay.
We have to, but we have no other choice because we couldn't go into classrooms and assign one teacher PBL and another one not. There would be too much bleeding. The sample sizes are too small. So we went to the best statisticians that we knew, asked them under the circumstances what would they suggest for the preliminary work to know if we're on the right track. They suggested single case design. We're getting the effects that we have. We're very clear. In the full-scale study in year 4, we're doing exactly what you had said. It's going to be an RCT to design with schools and teachers doing traditional work and PBL teachers in the other situation. I have been very concerned about, I'm a sociologist. My friends, they would look at me and say, well, that's very nice, Barbara, I'm not, they're not psychologists. They wouldn't be at all interested in how people feel. I'm trying to get them to make them feel more that way, but that's not their beginning. So what do we have? The state, first the teachers have given us the kids' grades, and we'll have their test scores on what we call the state test, which is the MEP. So you're absolutely right. Yes, we have those. Yes, we have grades. Yes, we have test scores, and we're going to look at those. So what we are doing right now is we're collecting the grades from year 1, and we'll collect the grades that the students got in December after their first semester, and we'll use those too as cognitive outcomes, as well as their MEP scores. And the MEP scores are achievement test scores, similar to what, you know, are on these kind of test pearls, etc.
And Wayne over here, and then Chris.
Thank you. I found it really, really interesting. Could you tell us a little bit more about how the students are actually using the app in the classroom situation?
Okay, sure.
And also, I was interested, it picks up on what we're saying about the cognitive assessments. But is assessments used in any other way within the project-based learning?
Yeah. So essentially, how does it work? To make sure that we're doing project-based learning in the science classes, it's a random beeping schedule that goes off. So we randomize the beeping schedule before we hand the phone to the student. So it beeps and then the student have to fill it out when they hear the beep. They get 7 beeps a day. And the reason that we do that is we have to be able to measure challenge and engagement in science to see if challenge and engagement in other classes looks the same, or how does it vary and how is it different. And we also want to understand how kids feel passively when they're doing other kinds of things. Because we would assume that there's a certain level of high engagement if you're a pianist or if you're an athlete, that you're going to have higher scores when you're engaged in these kind of activities. We promise the schools we will not beep the kids during tests, because the teachers get very nervous about that when they're on the playing field or if they're in a concert. So we have to work out the beeping schedules to take that into account. We also tell the kids to ignore that. They get directions that we come in. We teach them how to use the phones. We give them examples. We ask them to raise their hand. All of this is done with our graduate students. The graduate students, if you came into our lab right now, there are hundreds of phones all over the floor as they basically start to randomize the beep schedules on the phone. We have actually bought all the phones for Finland too, so Finland's using the same phones as us. Not only that, we've sent over our people to Finland so that we're all working on the same kind of beeping schedule, so that we can actually look at these things and have more consistency from one place to the other. Now, PBL. PBL right now uses primarily formative assessment, and then the only kind of what I would call close to a summative assessment that they used is the quality of the artifact that gets produced. Now, the difficulty with that is when we give report cards and we do everything else in the U.S., we don't put on yours, well, who was in your group and how did the group look? I mean, that's just not something that we do. My colleague, Joseph Krajcek, would love us to be able to do that, would love us to basically say this was your contribution to the artifact, and the artifact is a 5. It's an excellent artifact. I don't think that's going to go down very well with the parents, and it sure is not going to go down with college admissions. And I know that the senator from Wisconsin, Paul Ryan, ain't going to buy that by one stretch of the imagination, which is why I said no way. If we're going to get any support for PBL, it's going to have to show that the kids learned science better on standardized measures. We've encouraged the teachers to use all kinds of formative assessments during in classes, but they're not used to developing those things either. I mean, that's another problem. Teachers are pretty used to teaching, especially in advanced level science classes, because they're getting them ready to come into college, and that's another problem. So they're not that well trained to be able to do that. We've encouraged that. We've talked about what other kinds of measures they could use. We're doing a lot with model building, which allows us to see how they think about preparing, like the coordinates in physics. So we're working on trying to teach causal inference, because we think that that's such an important part of the physics discussion. So we've been working on helping them to develop these models by which you look at two varying components on your X and Y axis. We think that by doing that over time, we may be able to see how many strokes they need to do that, how quickly they can get to their model. So we can see internally, because it's all done online, how long it takes and what they're able to do. But the bottom line is, the hope is that they all can do it at the end. So, yes, they've all been competent in doing this. I have one more comment on this one thing, if I can. Competency-based instruction and competency-based measures is becoming a much more important part of college admissions in the U.S. because they are so worried about these issues of affirmative action and so many other things, and because there's so much controversy over the SAT and the ACT, that a lot of the colleges have moved to ACT and SAT away from that, and are thinking about, can we adjudicate admission on issues of competency, like how well do you write and communicate, and then what skill set do you have? Can you do Java coding and that kind of thing?
Chris, one final question?
Yeah, no,
I'm
my
sorry.
question
Yeah,
has
don't worry.
been answered, because it was about the curriculum being set up for the kind of testing that happens and how that would fit in, so you've already answered that.
Yeah, and you've asked all the right questions, and they are the questions that we are We have also on our advisory panel are, Larry Hedges, who's, a world-renowned statistician, and Jim Pellegrino, who works on formative assessment and different kinds of learning environments, because we think that this is unquestionably the big challenge here.
Yeah, thank you very much. We now have the webinar.